Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Liam McIlvanney in person. The last time I think we did this, Liam, you were over in New Zealand.
Yes, 12,000 miles away, Alistair, so it's nice to be face to face for a change.
It really is, absolutely. We're going to talk about The Good Father, your latest novel. And before we get stuck into it, I just want to say I think it's sensational. I mean, I didn't know what I was expecting, but I didn't expect this,
right.
and in all the best ways. I'm really interested, first of all, how you describe it to people, maybe how you consider it yourself.
Well, that's very heartening to hear. First of all, thanks very much, Alistair. It's not the easiest book, I belatedly realised after I'd written it, to talk about and to promote, because it's got, I mean, I suppose it begins with the disappearance of a child. There's a couple, Gordon and Sarah Rutherford, and Gordon's been in charge of their 7-year-old son, Rory, and he gets distracted and the boy goes missing on the beach. And so the long first part of the book is a kind of deep emotional dive into the aftermath of a child's disappearance. But then there are a couple of fairly dramatic twists in the book. But of course, when you're talking about the book to people, you've just got to say, well, you've got to take my word for that there are big dramatic twists, which of course you can't give away the silver and say what the twists are.
Yeah, I've got it in big letters here, no spoilers.
Yes,
so if you ever veer into that territory, just put your hand up and I'll move away from it. Yeah. But, you know, you're known for crime fiction, and although crimes do happen in this book, it's not a traditional crime novel. It's
quite different. The two previous books were fairly straightforward police procedurals set in Glasgow in the late 60s and 70s. I think partly what attracted me to this story was the simplicity of the structure. So, you know, particularly the police procedurals that I've been writing, there's quite a lot of moving parts. You've got your sort of main plot with the investigation, you've got a subplot with the criminal, these mesh at some stage, you've got your clues, you've got your red herrings, you've got your sections from the victim's perspective. So there's an element of kind of narrative algebra where you're trying to sort of, you know, keep all these different elements in sync and sort of create the narrative from that. And I was just really attracted to the idea that this was simply, it was a difficult book to write emotionally because of the subject matter, but it was a really straightforward book to write technically because the structure is quite simple. You've got this deep dive into the sort of emotional aftermath of a child's disappearance, and then when you get those twists, it's a straight escalation. Things go wrong, they go further wrong, they go more catastrophically wrong than you could have envisaged. And that's quite straightforward to do structurally. So it's quite a fast book to write. I'm not the fastest crime writer on the block, but this one was, I did this one at quite a lick, I think, because I could see the end sort of barreling towards me. I knew where I was going.
So you always knew from the start?
Yes.
Kind of how it would be structured and where it was going?
Yes. And so I had those kind of big twists in mind fairly early on, so it made it quite straightforward. I was quite excited writing it, to get to those bits. So yeah, I found it quite, it's quite a dark book in many ways, but I found it quite an enjoyable book to write, I think, for those reasons.
Yeah, it is a very dark book in places, absolutely. And that original premise, as you say, parents losing a child or a child goes missing, I mean, it's difficult to imagine anything worse. So why did you want to engage with that as a kind of beginning point?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it was partly partly kind of came out of the terrain, the topography that I was living in the village of Fairley on the Ayrshire coast. And I was going to say it's an idyllic kind of seaside village. I went for a walk on the beach this morning in Fairley and it was sort of blowing a hoolie and it felt like kind of mid-December. But ordinarily at this time of year, it's quite an idyllic. This time of year,
it's usually nice, yeah.
Yes, an idyllic. And when you're in that kind of spot, you often think as a crime writer, it feels like the kind of place where nothing bad can happen. You know, you're sort of, you've got the hills behind you, you've got this little kind of almost one street village, you've got the beach and a little strip of firth and the sheltering bulk of Cumbria. And it's like a little bowl. You feel insulated from danger and you sort of think that all the bad stuff happens at the end of the railway line in Glasgow, in the big bad city, but you're sort of safe down here on the coast. And so I think in that sort of context, you get a more dramatic impact when something catastrophic happens. And I think the characters also, they're sort of lulled into a sense that they're beyond the reach of danger. And of course, as it transpires, they're not. So it was partly suggested by the topography. I think it was also just that thing where anyone who's either been a parent or been in charge of a child has had that moment where, you're in the supermarket or wherever you are, you're distracted, and you realise, oh, wait a minute, I can't see the kid. And there's just that horrible moment where you think, okay, the die is cast. Either everything's fine and kid will come round the corner, or potentially something catastrophic has happened. And in my own experience, when that's happened to me and I've been distracted, thankfully, I've had the good card.
Yeah.
But I guess I was just thinking, well, what would happen if you had the other card? How would you respond to that? How would that affect your life and your outlook on the world? So it was partly that, and the attraction of that in some sense was that it's not a premise that requires a lot of research. Again, the books that I've been writing recently have been books that do require quite a lot of research into 1970s Glasgow and police procedures and so on. This was just a kind of emotional research. Yeah. It was how you would feel if this happened to you. Yeah. So I didn't have to go away and do any of that research. I could just sort of write it from my own emotional experience.
But, I mean, I think you mentioned it was quite difficult to write. I can only imagine it must have been difficult to write, to put yourself in those positions.
Yes. So there is an element of that. You've got to kind of, take things to the end of the line a bit emotionally. And, you've got, it's, the character is quite close to my own kind of experience in some ways. The guy's a literary academic. But I guess it was like the old idea that if the circumstances are sufficiently challenging and extreme, you will find yourself doing things that you never imagined you were capable of. So yeah, there were some challenging scenes to write because of that. But I think you also, you can also get just caught up in the sentence by sentence sort of enthusiasm and excitement of writing, and that tends to carry you through some of those dark undertows in the experience.
I think as a reader, it definitely asks questions of you. What would you do? What would this? Is that the way you would react or whatever? So let's start at chapter 1. As I said, we're going to avoid spoilers at all points here. So at the very, very beginning, you've got a quote from Robin Robertson, and I thought that was interesting, from his kind of book on Scottish folktales.
Grimoire, right. Yes.
Grimoire, yeah. Uh-huh. So why choose that as a quote?
I often have little excerpts of poetry as my kind of epigraphs, Alistair, and I often read poetry when I'm writing. I often read poetry to try and kind of get the engine running. There's something about reading language used at that level of intensity that I think sort of stimulates me as a writer just on a day-to-day basis. So I often find myself going back, and often I go back to poets that are quite dark. I tend to think there's an anthology to be made at some stage of crime fiction poetry. People like Paul Muldoon, Robin Robertson, even back to the Scottish ballads, there's actually quite a lot of dark kind of crime-oriented poetry, but Robin Robertson's poetry really speaks to me on that level, and the darkness, the kind of he's not afraid to go into really emotionally dark places, and there's something I think that corresponds to crime fiction. There's something that answers to crime fiction in his poetry. So I read him quite regularly, and that just seemed to be a little excerpt that sort of set up.
I'm always interested in why, what people choose as epigraphs and put them in. And we'll talk a bit more about this later, but the Scottish ballads also kind of feed into a lot of the novel too. And you've mentioned that the central character, Gordon Rutherford, is a university lecturer, as you are.
Yep.
He's writing about the Scottish ballads, and there's lots of kind of reference. I think there's a Tom Leonard reference in there and lots of things. So talk a bit about Gordon Rutherford and, your own relationship with Gordon.
Yeah, again, I think that was partly, right. The previous two books had been writing about Duncan McCormick, who not only is in the 1960s and 1970s, so you have to, inhabit that, sort of make that imaginative leap. But he's also quite a different character to me. He's gay, he's Catholic, he's Highland. I'm straight Presbyterian Lowlander. So there was an element of, André Gide, the French novelist, said that the way to bring a character to life was often to write about a character that shared quite a lot of your background, but give yourself something different that would give you an oblique approach to the character, or some challenge that you had to meet to inhabit that character. And that's often what brings it to life. And sometimes when you're writing too close to your own personal experience, it can be a bit flat. There's not enough friction.
Right.
So Duncan McCormick certainly gave me that challenge of, and some of the pitfalls too, of having to, write a gay character and get those things right and stay true to that experience as far as you could. This was much closer to home in the sense that he's a middle-aged Scottish literary academic. There was a slight element of relaxing into a warm bath in that characterisation. Yeah. After having, and again, it's like, I didn't have to research this. He's doing a job I've done for 28 years, so hopefully I might know a couple of things about it. And I found it really useful drawing on that academic experience, and he gives lectures on James Hogg, and he's writing a book about the Scottish ballads. And I sometimes feel in my work that I'm doing sort of two different things. I've got my academic day job where I write about literature, and I've got my career, such as it is as a novelist. And often they seem to be quite disparate elements of what I do.
Yeah.
But this is a book that they kind of merge a bit, and I liked that I was sort of bringing those elements together, and I suppose also, alluding to some of the wellsprings of the kind of fiction that I think I'm writing. So, so people often think that, Scottish crime fiction started in the 1970s or whatever, but of course it doesn't. It's got a much longer trajectory back through James Hogg and Walter Scott's Two Drovers, and back to the Scottish ballads. And something about the ballads in particular, these narrative poems that deal with really dark themes of death and murder and betrayal and, hangings and drownings and parricides and so on. But they do so in a really starkly unsentimental fashion. There's a real kind of chill often in how the ballads deal with that material. And they deal with it in a great kind of clip. There's very often ellipses and sort of time passes between stanzas. They're very sort of cinematic. They're often very dialogue driven. They're quite heavy in dialogue. So they seem to me to speak in all sorts of ways to the form of the crime novel. And particularly in the Scottish case, I think a lot of Scottish crime fiction draws on that longer tradition that the ballads represent. So I think I was having a lot of fun bringing that material in.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, resonates quite directly with some of the action in the novel.
Mm-hmm. So, you go on at one point, I think, or Gordon rather, goes on to talk about how the Scottish ballads are almost, in some ways, the part of the building blocks of the Scottish literary tradition. Stevenson, Hogg, as you suggest, Spark, going on to modern days as well. And I think that's a really, for anyone who's got an interest in Scottish writing, there's a lot to be taken out of that. So, in terms of going back to Gordon, you was almost the kind of familiarity with him and his life, was that what allowed you to go extreme and push him to the extreme?
Exactly. I think when you've got a character like that, who is, let's face it, as I am, a slightly dull individual whose idea of a good time is to sort of sit down with a cup of tea and read a book, who's a sort of family man who goes about his business, goes up to the city and, does his lectures and comes back and enjoys his domestic life. I think when you get a character like that, and you can show that even a character like that can be capable of some extraordinary actions, I think again you get that greater sense of impact. But also what I was trying to do with Gordon was to have little suggestions and layer in little elements earlier in the book where you think, yes, it's quite shocking that this character ends up in the position he is, but also that you can see elements in his character that make it not so surprising that he goes down the road that he does later in the book. But I think, you know, the way that in crime fiction you often, if you're dealing sometimes with sort of grand dramatic happenings, sort of grand guignol gestures, it's nice to have that kind of counterbalance of, you know, a sort of mundane domesticity that you're rendering. It's the kind of Saul Stein thing that, you know, we have to know the people in the car before the car crashes. It's that sort of thing. And that was partly what I was trying to do, was give us quite a long and intimate familiarity with these characters and with Gordon in particular, so that when things go dramatically wrong later in the novel, the reader hopefully is invested in that character and sort of goes along with them, albeit sort of watching through their fingers.
Because when I finished reading it, I was thinking, how am I just going to describe this? I think it's domestic, yet it's epic. And I think everybody's domesticity is kind of, might be to them and to other people looking from the outside, mundane and ordinary, until it's not, until something major happens. And this could not be more major. And then suddenly, you know, you have the outside... They have the outside world coming in, they have the media, they have police, they're dealing with all these things, which just, you never think that you're going to have to deal with when you're living your life on a kind of day-to-day basis, as their whole family are. That's
right. And I think domesticity has always intrigued me as a subject, because it's both the smallest subject and the biggest. You know, a lot of the great dramas in, you know, world literature and sort of narrative television and film are centred on family for very obvious reasons. But that day-to-day narration of family life and domesticity has always intrigued me too. And it's quite a difficult thing to do in fiction in some ways, because domesticity is not inherently narrative shaped. You know, you just sort of pootle around, you know, you take the bins out on a Tuesday, you take them out on the next Tuesday, you drive your kid to football practice. You know, it's just sort of the ongoing mundanity of domestic life. But it also contains the things that are most important to people, and it's where the stakes are highest. So when something hits you at that level of your life, it really does literally come home to you, and you can find yourself, as I say, embroiled in some fairly serious drama. So I like that. I like that domesticity has got both ends of the spectrum. It's kind of where nothing happens, and it's also where everything happens.
I'm really interested in the pacing of the novel, because, as you say, they've got this opening chapter where we find out that this terrible event has happened and a child's gone missing. And then domesticity comes in. People get on with their lives as you would have to. The media starts to forget. The phone calls with the police become less and get on and that goes on for a while. And as a reader, I'm going, okay, I'm not sure where this is going to go. And I was interested in how you managed to think about the balance of the novel.
It was I've said it's quite a straightforward novel to write structurally. And on one level it is. I suppose my major structural problem, if there was one, was time. That I wanted to write a novel that gave the experience of losing a child sufficient narrative gravity and weight, and not use that simply as a plot point for an investigation to barrel forward. But to sort of look at that in quite granular detail. And you know, this is an experience that, you know, what if you just kept falling? What if there was no bottom to the abyss? What would that look like? How would that affect you? How would it sort of curdle your relationships and your outlook on the world? And could you write about that over time while maintaining a sense of narrative tension with the reader? So my aim there, I guess, was to try and write a different type of thriller, and write a thriller that was a sort of emotional thriller rather than an action thriller at this stage of the book, and a thriller that was fueled, if you like, by anguish rather than adrenaline, and see if you could hold the reader, if you could maintain that tension, that sense of anguish and dread in the reader, well, you do this over quite a long period of years. So I guess that was the sort of bet I set myself, that, can you do this? And I think if you can do that, then the payoff when the narrative speeds up, I think, is greater. The thriller is very often a genre where time, for good reason, is compressed. It takes place over 2 or 3 days, or very often in thriller, the actual narrative sections are day 1, day 2, day 3. You've got a ticking clock. You have to catch the killer before he kills again. You have to defuse the bomb before it goes off. And so I wanted to try and write a thriller where you stretched that out for the opening part of the novel. And if you could hold the reader through that, then I think the payoff is greater when things come up to speed in the second part of the book, and we move at the conventional pace of the thriller.
I think it works brilliantly because you really get to know the characters. You get to get a bit of, as you say, you start to build pictures that are perhaps unexpected. You think, oh, what happens later on? There may be little pins in those bits. You can go back and think, oh yeah, that could relate to that. And it's looking at grief, and a grief where they're not entirely sure how they should grieve, because there's hope.
Still an element of hope.
Yeah,
should you feel that hope or not?
Absolutely. Yep. So you go along with them over years that this kind of unfolds, and I mean, in some ways, I think actually the book's split into 3 parts. Is that right?
Well, I suppose I'm thinking of it now in 2
I think
parts.
There's part 1, part 2, part 3. I think that.
Yes, I tend to do that. I've always sort of done that kind of 3-act thing with the sort of.
But it really is 2, isn't it?
Yes, it really is 2.
Yeah, and so, and again, was that something that you knew from the start, that there was going to be this kind of middle ground that would just change everything?
Yes. And as I say, it made it quite. I enjoyed writing that opening section, but I also was. I kind of couldn't wait to get around to the second part, because I sort of knew what was coming. So
there was a kind of sense of restraint, almost like, no, I'm going to take my time with this.
We're just going to stretch this out a little, and then the big bang will happen. So it's quite a different book, as I've said, structurally to the ones I've written before, and it was a little freer. Very often with the police procedurals, because you're dealing with so many moving parts, you have to plan things out, at quite a detailed level before you begin. Whereas this was, I knew the big things that were going to happen, but there was a sense of just sort of freewheeling towards that, and I think generating a bit of narrative momentum, just because you didn't necessarily know exactly how you were going to get there.
I think we've got to the point when we're talking about the narrative that we can go no further.
Yes, I think that's it. We're at the dead end.
Absolutely. But let's talk then about some of the other characters, because we've spoken about Gordon, but then there's his wife, Sarah, there's her sister, Becky, is a very interesting character, and others as well. They've got other children, for instance.
Yes.
So how the family structure, it's an interesting one.
Yes. I was living, as I said, when I wrote it, in fairly... in fact, I finished writing it in my sister-in-law's, the cabin. She's got a wooden cabin in the garden of their house there in Fairley, so I finished writing it there. So a lot of that kind of wider family material came into play, I think. And I think it was partly just enjoying writing about the sort of domestic dimension, and life, as you say, has to go on at some level, even in the midst of these catastrophic happenings. And I've always enjoyed that aspect of fiction. I think in the police procedural, it's more difficult to do that. Very often in police procedurals, you've got a protagonist who is almost defined by the absence of domestic life. I mean, a lot of times
the loner,
their marriage is broken up and so on. They don't see their children, and they sort of go out into the world of adventure to solve crime, and they leave that kind of mundane world of domesticity behind. But I've always liked fictions that try to combine the two, and that have a lot of action and adventure, but also have that taking place in the kind of realistically rendered domestic world of people having to get on with their lives.
And just as we're talking, it strikes me that this is your most personal novel to date, would you say?
Undoubtedly, yes. There's a lot of me in it. There's a lot about fathers and sons, and being a father and being a son. And so, there's again, I think that's why I found it both enjoyable to write and emotionally sometimes challenging. There's quite a lot of introspection and looking at your own emotional hinterland and your past. But in other words, I think it was a book that I couldn't have written. It couldn't have been my first book. I needed to sort of mature as a writer to write this book, I think.
Yeah, so the time was right for this.
The time was right for it.
And I think, if I'm right in saying, the very final word is closure, and at the beginning it's like, don't say that word to me. Yes. Was there a sense of that in a way in the novel that, I've now written about a lot of this stuff which is so personal to me, and it's
closed, I can leave it alone.
Yeah.
And rather than sort of fret and brood about those things, putting them onto the page and exploring them is a way of finding closure, ironically.
And what about the rest of your family, though? You're writing a character who, can be linked to yourself, where there are other members of the family going, is that me? Do you think that's what I do?
Aye, there's all of that. I mean, I think you've got to... Well, I try to sort of remind people that there's never a one-to-one correspondence between characters in a novel and characters in real life. There's always some element of sort of alchemy or transmogrification that takes place. But whether they're convinced by that, Alistair, I'm not sure.
Yeah. You've always got that of course, it's fiction, of course.
Yes, indeed.
And I'm interested as well, did you do research for the novel at all?
Not hugely. I mean, I think, missing children.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, so that stuff's always in the news. And I suppose, things like the Madeleine McCann case, although I didn't sort of research that or look into it deeply, obviously that's, I think, part of what I was drawing on in the book, just that you're aware of those cases over the years and how they're unfolding. I'm not the kind of crime writer who tends to draw directly on, newspaper stories or who tries to write topical and up-to-date fiction. So I think there was I didn't do research into that as such. I think the research was really internal. It was more emotional. How would you feel if this happened to you? And I really enjoyed that aspect of it, that sometimes research is a little bit of a crutch, that you go off and do your research and you think, right, I can just pour that into the book and, create this sort of narrative world. But I liked the idea that it was just kind of me and the page. Having written quite a lot of books that required quite a lot of research, I really enjoyed just letting that, there's a bit of a kind of tightrope there that, if it's just you and your own emotions and your sort of emotional hinterland, I think you need a little bit of self-belief to write a book that's just based on that and not ballasted by
because I guess research and even writing a police procedural, where you do have to do a bit of that as well, it can be a bit of a safety net in that sense, whereas here it's kind of all out. And even the way that latterly Gordon, the choices he makes, let's put it that way, you can say, well, as a reader, and I guess as the writer even more so, what would I choose to do? Because there's a lot of moral questions in this novel.
There are, and I suppose the title itself raises those, Alistair, that, I've been asked a couple of times, is Gordon Rutherford a good father? And in some ways, I don't think it's really for me to judge. The reader can come to their own conclusions in that. I think he thinks he's a good father, and he tries to be a good father, and he tries to do what he thinks is the right thing. And so I sort of empathise with that. I would like to think, I guess, that I might not make precisely the choices that he makes if I were faced with the situation that he finds himself in.
But it's putting people like Gordon in extreme positions. It's the only way you can kind of find out. So as he acts, and some of the other characters as well, does that ever surprise you? Do you know where it's going?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are different sort of schools of thought about how you create character, and some writers know a great deal about their characters before they come to the page, and they have a dossier of information, and they know, you know, what their childhood pet was called and their favourite colour and who their primary school teachers were.
A method actor might find out stuff that never gets mentioned.
But I've always, I suppose, veered more to the David Mamet school, where Mamet says you don't need any of that. All you need to do is give your character a dilemma. Which way do they jump? That tells you who your character is. So very much believing in that you know, you find out who your character is by posing them a dilemma and then seeing how they respond to it. Of course, I guess you could say that the more you know about your character, the clearer an idea you will have of which way they might jump in particular circumstances. But as you say, they very often surprise you. I don't really subscribe to the notion that, you know, characters develop a life of their own and sort of go off and do things in the, you know, without the consent of the novelist. But I think you can, you know, there are latencies in a character that reveal themselves when the time is right that you might not be fully conscious of. And similarly, in structural terms, there are characters who you create and you think you've got them in the little box, and later on in the novel you need a character to do something, and you're on the verge of inventing a new character for that, and then you realise, oh no, I've already got that character. This character would be the very person who would do that. So I never know if that's just serendipity or if part of your brain is thinking, I know what you're about to do. I know where this narrative's going, and I'm setting things up for you further down the line.
I think that's really interesting, because as the book moves on, there are characters who do things that you think, oh yeah, the seeds of that are definitely in even the initial.
But I think it's better for both for the writer and the reader, because I think one of the challenges when you've got a character who sort of emerges to do something dramatic is sort of backgrounding that character and not making that too apparent from the off. And if you yourself don't know that this character is about to engage in this activity, you've already, you know, ipso facto backgrounded them, you know, because you didn't know.
Yeah.
So that stuff can work really well. And so I think, you know, in terms of structure, I try to work out quite a lot in advance, and I'd never really have the stamina to do that. But I do like to think that at some subconscious level, you are actually doing that, and you kind of know at some level that this character will appear and be useful for you later on in the narrative.
I guess one of the reasons for asking that is that as you read and as Gordon is faced with these extreme situations, you're going, oh, don't do that. Oh, no, don't do that. You know, and I wondered if that was the same for you. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm do that. But yes, I can imagine from the other side of the perspective, it's different.
Yeah, well, and in terms of the title, I wondered, did you have that from the beginning? Was that, you know, or did that emerge as you were writing?
Yeah, I'm always terrible at titles. The idea is to have your title before you write the novel, and then you can write it sparking all sorts of clever resonances off your title. But I almost invariably end up with, I've got a working title that isn't quite right, and then it's very often the very last thing I do is actually come to the final title. So I didn't, I think my working title for this book was The Picture Window, which is a pretty terrible title. But I think you establish a kind of working title early on, and very often I just leave that as a kind of holding thing, and then sort of try to come up with a better title at the end. So no, this was a bit of another last minute title, I'm afraid.
That's really interesting to me, because as you say, the novel, it's about fathers and sons across generations, actually, and this idea of being good. You know, sometimes self-delusion that I'm a good person, you know, I'm good, I'm good. And that's kind of how Gordon justifies a lot of these things. I am doing these for the good, because I am good. I am a good father.
Yes, and he's so invested in the role of fatherhood, partly because of his own family background and that old thing of trying to kind of rectify the mistakes as he perceives them of his own father. So a lot of his personality is invested in the role of being a father. So again, there's quite a lot at stake, I think, when that role is challenged.
And you said you wrote this when you were in Fairley and Faithfully.
In Fairley, yes.
Fairley, and the place is a really important part of it. I think we've touched on it a little bit. So it's near Largs. You've got that whole kind of West Coast drive, and he kind of eventually uses it well. Let's put it that way. It was important in terms of place. Again, a place you know well.
Yeah, there's something about. I mean, so obviously I live 12,000 miles away from the place that I write about,
but you know it well.
But I know it well, and I do think I'm often asked, does it clarify? Does distance clarify? Is it easier or harder? I don't actually think that it makes that much difference, because I think for some writers, certainly for me, your imaginative furniture is sort of laid down at quite an early age, I think. And so when I write about Ayrshire, I'm not really, necessarily writing about, topical issues in Ayrshire. I'm not trying to get, if you want to get the kind of up-to-date accuracy of the topography, you can go to Google Maps and you can see, does this street lead into this street, and you can do all that. But actually, as a writer, I think you're much more drawing on, what is the quality of light in a place? What is the particular shade of green on a hillside? What are the kind of idiomatic phrases that people characteristically use? What are the stories that they use to make sense of their world? And all that stuff is something that I can tap into, whether I'm writing it back in Scotland, as I did with a lot of this book, or whether I'm writing it in New Zealand. I kind of have equal access to that wellspring of memory. Always go back to the great New Zealand writer Catherine Mansfield, who said something like, I shall tell everything, even how the laundry basket squeaked, which I love, but I already know how the laundry basket squeaked.
Yeah.
I've got all that in my memory and I can tap into that at any time. So on the one hand, I think it is a novel that could happen anywhere. I mean, the premise is basically, something catastrophic happens in an idyllic seaside community. So it could be, North Cornwall or Monterey or anywhere else. But there is something about the particular topography of that place that I really responded to and that brought the story to life for me.
I think there's a familiarity in terms of, going back to that term domestic again, the life of Gordon and Sarah and their family, it just absolutely rings true. And I think that's perhaps due to the familiarity that you have with the people and the place.
I think so. I mean, there's a Maori term, Turanga Waiwai, which literally means standing place. And it's the idea that you've got a particular place where you feel at home, you know how things work, you stand tall. And although I'm 12,000 miles away, Ayrshire's still my Turanga Waiwai. It's the place that I feel comfortable writing about. And although I've lived in New Zealand for nearly 20 years, and I've written bits and pieces about New Zealand, and I've got the start of a novel set in New Zealand.
Oh, right.
I would never be able to write about New Zealand with the same, not just authenticity, but the same enthusiasm that I can bring when I write about Ayrshire in the west of Scotland.
Interesting. The previous podcast was with the writer Andrew Meehan, who's from Ireland, but has lived in Glasgow for, and again works at Strathclyde University. And his new novel, Best Friends, is again written in Ireland, and he said he had started, or he's spoken about one in this area that we're sitting in now, it's outside of Glasgow. He said, but I just, for the reasons you state, my touchstone, my stone is in Ireland, and that I know the language, I know the pub, I know all the places, and I know the people, and that's where I feel I can get the best out of my writing.
Absolutely, and you need that. If that's what gets you excited as a writer, then you need to attend to that. There's no point trying to artificially say that I should really write about someone else because I've happened to live there for 20 years. And
I said at the beginning, a lot of the book is about, there's allusions to writing itself and about fiction itself and everything. Can I read a brief quote from it? Is that okay? It's on page 313 if I can get it. And it's Gordon quoting Thomas C. Foster. He says, "One of the problems that bedevils crime fiction is what Thomas C. Foster has called the weightlessness of murder in the genre." And I thought, there's nothing weightless in this. There's consequences and a real thing. Was that something that you were very aware of as you were writing it?
Absolutely. And I think, that's not a criticism of crime fiction as a genre. Those are the rules of the game, and very often in Agatha Christie and Golden Age novels, the victim is quite consciously someone who's quite an unsympathetic character because they're just being used as a plot point. We don't want to be distracted by the actual emotional fallout of the crime. We just want to proceed directly to the virtuosity of the detective who's investigating it. And that's one perfectly respectable way to write a crime novel. But I've always been interested in kind of slowing that down, trying to respond to the gravity of murder or disappearance or whatever the crime may be, and often look at it from the victim's perspective as well as the investigator's perspective, and just get a sense of the importance, the significance of those events that are sometimes just kind of glossed over and used as plot points in the crime novel. So that was very much part of what I was attempting in this book. Yeah,
because right through there's an emotional heft that's quite rare in crime novels, and that's why at the beginning I asked you to describe it, because I'm not sure if people read it and didn't know you and your work, they might not even think of it as a crime novel.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I started off writing novels without really knowing that much about crime fiction as a genre, and I think over the course of the 5 novels that I've written, I've become much more familiar with the conventions and the marks that you have to hit as a crime writer. But yeah, I think I have sort of departed a little from that classic police procedural investigative format here, and it's much more about the kind of emotional resonance and impact and effects of the crime.
And as we've suggested, things shift in part 2, perhaps in that sense. But it's I think going back again to how long you spend setting the scene with Gordon and the family after this event of losing their child, or at least him going missing, gives that emotional heft for the reader. We're really, really invested in these people.
Yeah, well, that was the idea that when you've spent this length of time with these characters, and when you've lived through it with them, and you've got a sense of how it has sort of torn through their family and completely upended their sense of themselves and their sense of what the world is like, that you're liable to go with those characters as they embark on some fairly dramatic actions in a way that might not be the case if we had sort of breezily, proceeded straight to the twists.
I'm wondering if you had an editor that you worked with on this book. I wondered if at any time it was like, crime fiction needs to be faster than this. Can we speed this up and get to this point?
Yeah. No, this book was edited by Ben Willis at Bonnier, who was a very sensitive editor, I thought, and he seemed to understand exactly what I was doing from quite an early stage. So, although you could certainly imagine other editors thinking, no, you need to, get to the more conventionally dramatic elements faster, I think he understood that if you actually, that the payoff, if you just sort of stretch that out a little, might be greater. So, yeah, it's quite an unconventional crime novel in that sense, particularly in how it deals with time and the passage of time, and how we've got in some ways you could almost say two different books between the same set of covers. So I think it probably required an editor who had a little bit of vision and could see that there was something that I had there was some sort of rationale behind what I was doing here.
Well, it absolutely makes the novel. I think that it would still have been a good read, but that part 1, let's call it that, absolutely makes the novel as a whole, I think.
Oh, that's great to hear.
And let's go back to questions of morality, because mentioned is James Hogg's Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, and I wonder that idea of justification again comes into it.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great I mean, that would be in my sort of top 2 or 3 novels of all time. I went interrailing as a 17-year-old round Europe for a month with a single book in my backpack, and it was Hogg's Confessions. So it's a book that's lived with me for decades, and the extent to which you've got, what I love about Confessions is that you've got again a book of 2 parts, and you've got 2 narrators, and you've got the central part that's narrated by the sinner himself, who thinks that God has commanded him to go around murdering people and, you know, cleansing the earth of sinners of various kinds. And then you've got that manuscript edited by this apparently rational and forensic and enlightened figure of the editor. But Hogg does a brilliant thing where the 2 narratives almost deconstruct one another, and you start to realise that the editor in his own way is as fanatical and partial and biased as the sinner. So I think that lies behind, you know, Gordon Rutherford seems at some level to be aligned to the editor of The Justified Sinner, if you like. He's the detached academic rational figure, except he's not. And so the roles get switched around, and Gordon, although he thinks his actions are justified in the way that Robert Ringham does in Hogg's novel, from an outside perspective, I think we're entitled to question that. So I think in all sorts of ways, and I'm not sure that was something that I was fully conscious of when I was writing the novel, but I think it's a book that's just in my literary bloodstream, as Sparks says of the ballads. And so I think, you know, subconsciously even you draw on those elements. But it's a book that, as everyone knows, that, you know, is one of the wellsprings of Scottish Gothic and crime tradition. And, you know, and of course it feeds into Stevenson and the doppelganger and duality and so on. But yeah, I think it's got a pretty direct influence on this book.
Yeah, because these 2 parts, they do speak to each other in it's sort of similar ways, because, as I mentioned before, there are clues in part 1 which really only make sense to you as you're getting through part 2, and you think, oh, okay. Because he is, again, going back to part 1, Gordon is, they're all struggling, of course they are, and you see that kind of ebb and flow throughout.
Yes. Yeah. So Hogg's there, you know, the ballads are there, and I think, you know, I think I felt it was time that I wrote a book that drew on my kind of academic understanding of those texts. I spend a lot of time in my day job sort of teaching and explicating those texts. And I think just in the process of time, by a kind of natural osmosis, they have now begun to sort of feed quite directly into the writing. Tim Winton, the Australian novelist, I remember reading an interview with him where he said that he has 2 desks in his office, and he's writing at one desk, and if the project he's working on isn't working, he sort of spins round and starts working on another project at the other desk. And I kind of feel as if that's, you know, I literally also have that in my office at the university. I've got a desk where I do my academic work, and then I sort of swing round and go through my kind of
don your crime
fictional phone booth and sort of come out to write crime at the other side. But I think this is the book where I don't really have that duality. I've got both things going on at once, and I think it's the better for it. Because
I think you said at the beginning of our chat that you almost look at the two as 2 different things. You know, you've got your writing a fiction, and then you've got your academic life as, you know, teaching Scottish literature and all that. So this time they are closer together than they've ever been.
They are. They're sort of beginning to converge, and it may be that, you know, my academic life has itself become closer to my sort of crime writing life, in the sense that over the past few years I've found myself teaching more in the creative writing field.
Right, that's interesting.
So previously I'd been teaching sort of straight academic papers on Scottish literature, but over the past few years I've found myself becoming embroiled in the teaching of creative writing, which was always something I was slightly ambivalent about. You know, can you teach writing, and I'm still quite ambivalent about it. But whether you can teach it or not, you have to learn how to write. And I think creative writing courses can create the circumstances in which you can almost do that for yourself, and you've got the camaraderie of a room full of people who are all in the same position, who are all trying to write, who are all trying to help one another and provide insights into one another's work. And that's been slightly belatedly in my sort of career as a teacher, that's been a great joy. I feel sort of rejuvenated in my teaching over the past few years by moving into the creative writing field. So I think on that level, there's now less of a distance between my academic work and my creative work than there was, say, 10 years ago.
Because I've asked writers before how if becoming a writer changed them as a reader. I don't think I've ever asked an academic if becoming an academic changed you as a reader and maybe even a writer.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that became clear to me was how little I knew about the actual mechanics of how a novel is put together. So I'd been a literary academic, sort of teaching courses on literature, I guess for probably about 15 years before I was faced with the task of writing a novel. And I sort of realised I'd been kind of stealing a living, pretending that I knew about, pontificating about novels and talking about themes and social context and so on. But I didn't really, if someone had put a gun to my head and said, what is a story? I might have struggled to come up with a coherent answer. Yep. So I sort of realised, no, this is actually, if you're going to write a novel, you have to actually understand how the sausage is put together. Mm-hmm. And, I had to go away and read books on story structure and sort of find out how a narrative hangs together. So yeah, it was quite a salutary exercise in sort of demonstrating the shortcomings of my own understanding of the novel from a purely academic perspective. I'm sure that teaching and reading and thinking deeply about novels, did help me and sort of laid down, I probably had a quite an intuitive understanding of chapter breaks or what a chapter might contain or different elements of the novel. But on that sort of overarching structural level, I had a lot of work to do to find out how to write a novel.
And if there's anyone listening who perhaps wants to be a writer themselves, is there one book that you would recommend and think, yeah, that's a good one for it?
Well, I think partly the question that I ask myself is, what are you not good at? I think it's important to understand your strengths and your weaknesses as a writer. And in all modesty, I think I know my way around a sentence. I think on a sentence per sentence level, I sort of know what I'm doing. But at the same time, structural questions never came easily to me. So I identified fairly early on that this was something I needed to do quite a lot of work on. So I've read, and I still read, I love to read books about story structure. Very often it's screenwriting manuals, because in screenwriting, structure is much more important in the sense that if you've got a chapter in a novel where nothing much happens and the story doesn't really move much further on, or there's nothing particular revealed about character, then that's okay. No one's died. It's just a longer in the novel. Of course, if it's a screenplay, it's just not going to be made because it costs money to make it. So it's just going to be cut out of the screenplay. So if you sort of train yourself in story by reading about screenplays, that's quite a good way in my experience of approaching the novel, because you've got, here's the classic sort of stark sense of what a narrative is, and then you can adapt that when you're writing a novel. So in terms of books, I suppose, John Yorke's Into the Woods is a great book about story structure. And that's kind of the idea that what a story is you go into the woods and you come back out. But he's brilliant. He's a guy who I think has worked on everything from sort of independent cinema to EastEnders, and he's got a really deep understanding of how story functions. And so he's great on things like, inciting incidents and Act 1 climaxes and midpoints and so on. And very often what I do when I'm writing is try to establish your 5 key turning points. And then once you've got those established, you've got a sense of structure, and then you can get down to the business, to the fun stuff, which for me is just the sentence by sentence writing. I'm a great believer in that Don DeLillo line. That's what I mean when I call myself a writer. I'm a sentence maker, like a donut maker, only slower. That's exactly what I think when I think about writing. But I think because I place such a value on the sentence by sentence writing, I recognise that it's crucially important to get the structural stuff right so that you can focus on the sentence by sentence stuff.
And going back to The Good Father and writing it and how, you could do it at a different pace than perhaps previously. Was that part of it? You were just enjoying you kind of had this structure, you knew where this was going, so you could go through it sentence by sentence.
Exactly. And that's a lot of what I do when I'm sitting at a desk. A lot of what I do is revising. That most of the time when I'm writing, what I'm actually doing is going back over what I've written and trying to tweak the syntax to make the sentence tighter, or replace a 3-syllable word with a 2-syllable word to improve the rhythm, the scansion of the sentence. So the music of the prose is a lot of what I like to focus on, and that's where I find that's the thing that I think I'm reasonably competent at. And it's the thing that I enjoy most about writing. But I think you also need to, or I certainly need to, have the scaffolding or the structure to let you just sort of write with confidence on the sentence by sentence level.
I think in that answer, I can see why you like to read poetry while you're doing it, because that's the kind of essence of what you're talking about.
Yes, and I very often find that poetry sort of bleeds into the prose, if you like. So you very often find that there's a line of iambic pentameter, or there's a kind of buried ballad stanza in a paragraph. And that's something that probably nobody will notice when they're reading. But I actually find that stuff quite, not just entertaining, but enjoyable to do when you're writing.
And The Good Father has been longlisted for this year's McIlvanney Prize for Bloody Scotland. And what a cracking list it is. I mean,
it's an extremely strong list. I don't envy the judges.
Either do I, have to say. But I think it really shows that, for me, the kind of landscape of Scottish crime at the moment is really healthy. And I don't know what you think. Do you think that's part of why it was the right time to write The Good Father? Because there's this breadth in Scottish crime. It's not maybe the narrow thing that people used to consider.
Absolutely. It's really, really broad, and people are doing so many different things. And it's not just the sort of traditional police procedural, although people are writing and writing very original police procedurals. But I think inevitably when you get a sort of critical mass of writers, and there is something slightly, the idea of tarte noir is just in some sense a kind of marketing term, but I think it also does speak to the fact that there is a very large body of excellent crime writers trying lots of different things. Callum McSorley doing the sort of humorous, bringing the humour into the crime novel, Denise Mina going off to write Raymond Chandler novel, and so on. There's lots of really diverse and different things happening in crime fiction. So when you've got a kind of ecosystem that is vibrant and diverse, I think it's easier to take a couple of risks and do something that you might not otherwise have done. Yeah.
And so you've seen that kind of landscape change over the years that you've been
absolutely involved. And it's also, although I don't write about New Zealand, the landscape of New Zealand crime writing is also burgeoning and becoming really diverse, and there's some great developments. A couple of months ago I chaired a session with Michael Bennett, the Maori crime writer, and he's basically, he's doing a fantastic thing. He's sort of bringing the conventions of crime fiction into dialogue with Te Ao Maori, the world of Maori, and he's looking at sort of indigenous understandings of death and spirituality and family, and he's kind of bringing those into the crime novel in quite an extraordinary way. And he does a brilliant thing where he incorporates quite a lot of Te Reo Maori, the Maori language vocabulary, into his crime novels, and he actually footnotes these terms for the non-Maori reader.
Yeah.
So you're reading the novel, but you're also getting an education in the kind of concepts that are informing the prose. So I guess my sort of two worlds of crime writing that I kind of swim in are the New Zealand world and the Scottish world, and there's fantastically innovative and exciting things happening in both.
Yeah. Well, Liam, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I mean, I think I have said to you, I hope I've conveyed how much I enjoyed The Good Father.
That's fantastic.
Tremendous novel. So all the very best with it.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Alistair. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.